These failed infrastructure projects were once thought to be a good idea, but whether caused by too much optimism and ambition or too little planning and execution, they just weren't meant to be. Join me as we take a look at 15 amazing failed infrastructure projects. Number 15. Walkie-Talkie Center. When any good architect designs a luxury hotel, they're probably concerned about many different elements, so they probably don't usually take the time to consider whether their design is likely to burn every single guest to a crisp. So we can only assume that architect Raphael Viñoly was as shocked as anyone else when guests started referring to his Las Vegas Vadar Hotel as the Death Ray Hotel, due to its curved design effectively creating a giant magnifying glass that intensified the light to dangerous levels. Still, Viñoly went on to take things to the next level with one of his subsequent projects, London's Walkie-Talkie Center. This was created using the same curved design, but somehow managed to make things even worse, because his building didn't just cook the residents, but everything out on the sidewalk too. As the sunlight hit the Walkie-Talkie Center, it acted as a giant mirror, focusing the light of the sun until it was so unbelievably hot that it managed to literally melt a Jaguar car which was parked outside on the street. Journalists even conducted an experiment and successfully managed to fry an egg in the light from the building. Needless to say, if you were walking past the Walkie-Talkie Center, it was generally a good idea to cross to the other side of the street. Number 14. Chicago Flood. There have been many incidents where workmen digging up roads accidentally hit a water pipe or an electricity line, but making a mistake big enough to cause a citywide flood big enough to end up in the history books is another matter entirely. On April 13, 1992, engineers were carrying out repairs on Chicago's Quincy Street Bridge, which by the way runs right over the Chicago River, when their construction equipment managed to tear a 20-foot hole through the wall of a tunnel sitting under the seabed. The result of this was a tidal wave consisting of 200 million gallons of seawater that came rushing into the city's underground tunnels, before making its way to the surrounding buildings and flooding more than 300 major structures. Authorities were obviously terrified of life-threatening utility and electrical failures, so the entire city center was evacuated, which might seem like an overreaction until you find out that some of the office workers had to deal with floodwaters of 40 feet or higher. And as for the engineers who caused the whole thing in the first place, well, sometimes all you can say is, whoops. Number 13. Tacoma Washington Bridge. The most famous images of the Tacoma Washington Bridge are the ones with it swaying around like it's a scene from some apocalyptic Hollywood movie, so you may already be aware of this entry on our list before we even start discussing it. But how could a bridge get to this point without a helping hand from an earthquake or some other natural disaster? After all, this was somewhat of a flagship model, the first ever cable suspension bridge and the third largest of its type at that time. It was also incredibly long, with both sides measuring 1,100 feet and with a 2,800-foot central span. So it certainly wasn't the kind of thing that you wanted to come crashing down into the water below, especially given that the construction costs were around $6 million, and that's in 1940 money. Sadly, however, that's exactly what happened. 4 months after it was built back in 1940, this ill-fated bridge collapsed because of something known as air elastic flutter. It was the first bridge to have plate girders used as roadbed support, and soon started to buckle and sway in the wind. So much so that when 50-mile-an-hour winds hit the bridge, it started to rise, fall, and twist until cracks formed, and the entire thing crashed into the river. It's been studied by engineers ever since as an example of what not to do. Number 12. Apartment buildings in WENZHOU, China. When a government decides to build apartment buildings, or any kind of buildings for that matter, they generally hire people who know what they're doing to carry out the job. Architects, engineers, construction companies, all make sense, right? Well, sadly, that wasn't the case with the Chinese government back in the 1970s, which led to a horrific tragedy involving the loss of human life. When the government decided to build this particular apartment building in the city of WENZHOU, they decided not to bother with the expense of hiring professionals and commission some local villagers to build it instead. Although I guess there was a method to their madness. Well, kind of. You see, the WENZHOU apartment building was supposed to provide good, clean housing to lower-income residents who moved to the area looking for work. Sadly, these cramped 6-story apartment buildings were about as far from clean and safe as you could get. Due to a combination of overcrowding and flimsy, outdated materials, several of the buildings came crashing down in October 2016, killing 22 residents in the process. The government subsequently claimed that they'd wanted to demolish and replace the buildings, and even attempted to buy out the residents, but none of them wanted to move for fear of losing their homes. This was certainly an infrastructure fail with a capital F. Number 11. Hyatt Regency Hotel, Kansas City. When the Hyatt Regency Hotel was built in Kansas City, Missouri back in 1978, it was meant to be a luxurious place to stay with a futuristic design, including a multi-story atrium with 3 suspended walkways. And so it was, well, at least for the first 2 years after opening. 1.5-inch steel rods held up these walkways, but this added a serious amount of stress to the overall structure, meaning that the design of the place didn't even meet the minimum safety requirements, which, let's be honest, is not a great place to start. Amazingly, the hotel managed to survive 2 years of regular business before disaster struck. On July 17th of 1981, an elevated walkway on the 4th floor suddenly collapsed and fell onto another walkway 2 floors below, which also collapsed. This was enough of a disaster in itself, of course, but this horrific event occurred on a Friday night, which meant that the concrete and glass platforms were loaded with partygoers, and when the entire thing came crashing down, the lounge beneath it was populated with a large amount of guests. 144 people lost their lives that night, and a further 200 were badly injured, leading the local police to describe it as the worst disaster we've seen in 25 years. Number 10. Attilius Stadium. If you want to see how reliable the architects and builders of ancient Rome were, then all you need to do is take a visit to the Eternal City itself and gaze in awestruck wonder at the buildings and monuments that are still standing. Mind you, not all of their projects were an unqualified success. Take this amphitheater, for instance, built by the Roman entrepreneur Attilius. Back in 27 AD, this incredibly rich guy ordered this place to be built in order to host the gladiator games. But sadly, like a lot of incredibly rich people in a property game, Attilius opted for speed and cheapness over quality and safety. According to legend, he asked builders to use cheaper materials, wood instead of stone for instance, which meant that the stadium was ultimately built on very unstable foundations. Now, you might wonder how we can lay this much blame at Attilius's door given that the event happened so very long ago, but we have our sources. Various ancient texts, all of which seem to tell exactly the same story. When the doors to this cheap and flimsy stadium finally opened, 50,000 people showed up and crammed themselves into the amphitheater, at which point the entire structure buckled under their weight, sending 20,000 spectators falling to their death, with thousands more injured. This is obviously an incredibly high death rate for any tragedy, and the Roman Senate certainly took note. Following the incident, they banned anyone from building stadiums without the correct materials, and every stadium would have to pass a safety inspection. In other words, this was the exact point at which health and safety officers were invented. Number 9. John Hancock Tower. As you can see, the John Hancock Tower, locally known as the Hancock, is a striking-looking building and certainly deserves to be on any list of impressive skyscrapers. Sadly, however, it's on our list of epic infrastructure fails. Although it was named after the insurance company which originally occupied the building, it does seem a fitting moniker for this place. In the same way John Hancock's prominent signature across the Declaration of Independence sticks out a mile from the other signatures surrounding it, the John Hancock Tower certainly sticks out from any other buildings in the area. Sadly, however, it's not just because of its slim design, or the fact that it looks a bit like a weird obelisk that keeps popping up in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Designed by architect Henry N. Cobb, this 62-story, 790-foot building has certainly had its share of problems. Since it was first built in 1976, it's become widely known for a variety of structural flaws. For instance, there was the design failure on its signature blue windows, with the possibility of the 500-pound panes detaching themselves and falling to the street below. And if that's not worrying enough for you, it's also thought that the entire building could overturn if the winds were strong enough. On a positive note, the Hancock has been the tallest building in Boston and New England since 1976. But for how long? Number 8. Versailles Wedding Hall. Firstly, I'd like to apologize for all the death and destruction in this video. This list certainly isn't meant to be depressing, but when infrastructure projects fail, destruction inevitably follows, and often, sadly, so does death. Unfortunately, this story is no different, and what should have been the happiest day of two people's lives ended up as the worst. On May 24, 2010, at Versailles Wedding Hall in Jerusalem, disaster struck when the floor started to sag, eventually collapsing underneath the wedding guests, tragically killing 23 of them and injuring hundreds more. And perhaps even more horrifically, because this was a wedding, the entire event was caught on camera. Why did this happen? Well, like so many of the entries on this list, a cheap building method was used, consisting of lightweight concrete, which after the incident was immediately banned. In addition to this, the Versailles Wedding Hall was originally designed in two halves, with one side being 3 stories tall and the other just 2, which meant that a portion of the third floor also acted as a roof, which is not great when you're hoping for structural integrity. Partitions had been installed to help with this, but had been removed purely for the wedding, and the sagging of the floor was noticed almost immediately. The owner saw this purely as a cosmetic issue, which ultimately led to one of the worst civilian disasters in the region's history. Number 7. Beauvais Cathedral. For our next entry, we're once again hopping into our time machine, but we're not traveling quite as far back as ancient Rome this time, but instead to 1284, at which point another historically famous infrastructure fail occurred at Beauvais Cathedral. The Cathedral of St. Peter of Beauvais is a Roman Catholic church in France, whose designers had the ambition to make it the largest Gothic cathedral in the country. Sadly, this was not to be, because after 2 separate collapses, one in the 13th century and one in the 16th, the cathedral still remains unfinished. To accomplish their ambition, the builders and planners needed to push themselves and their resources to the brink, and this cathedral suffered because of it. When Beauvais Cathedral officially opened in 1272, the supports were not even complete, which resulted in the choir vault collapsing in 1284, under the strain of poor workmanship and high winds. The current structure is just part of the original plan, but you can see that the foundations were obviously supposed to be used for a much larger structure. Construction was finally abandoned in the 1600s, and these days the only part of the cathedral which can be accessed are the choir vault and the central nave. Infrastructure fail? Yep. Number 6. KEMPER Arena. Here's yet another example of poor planning before a construction project started, and yet another stadium. But unlike those unfortunate people in ancient Rome, this one wasn't supposed to be used to throw Christians to the lions. Well, not unless the Christians and Lions are 2 football teams I haven't heard of. Kansas City's KEMPER Arena was built in 1972 as a new home for the Kansas City Kings, and at first everything seemed to be going swimmingly. The designs were fresh and innovative, looked great on paper, and the architect even won an award from the American Institute of Architects. Surely nothing could go wrong, right? Well, no, wrong. I mean, it wouldn't be on this list otherwise, would it? In 1979, the roof of the KEMPER Arena completely collapsed after a heavy rainstorm. But how could that have happened to a building with so much critical acclaim from the architectural community? The American Institute of Architects even inspected the place the day before the incident, so you'd think they would have spotted anything wrong. So what the hell happened? The arena had been built with a flat roof, which people had been voicing their concerns about for a while, so the engineers added a temporary reservoir to reduce any stormwater runoff. But that wasn't enough. The local code required 64 runoff drains, and the KEMPER Stadium only had 8. As such, when it rained, the reservoir overflowed. The entire roof collapsed under the weight, and the pressure was so bad that it even blew out some of the arena's walls. Not a great result by any standard. Number 5. The BANQIAO Dam. This event is known as the BANQIAO Dam failure, so we can not only be sure that there's not going to be a happy ending, but it's also pretty much guaranteed a place on our list of infrastructure fails. Built in 1950, the BANQIAO Dam, nicknamed the Iron Dam, stood at 387 feet high, could hold up to 17 billion cubic feet of water back, and was designed to hold back the 1,000-year flood, which occurs every millennium in the area. So yeah, a pretty stressful job for any dam. And maybe that's why it fell to pieces. Mind you, Typhoon Nina also had a little bit of a part to play. In 1975, this typhoon devastated the area. The rain lasted for 3 days, producing 40 inches every single day, and ultimately creating floods that were twice the level the dam could deal with. Needless to say, the dam gave way. A wave of water 33 feet high and 7 miles wide rushed forward at 30 miles per hour, completely destroying the downtown area and killing around 10,000 residents. Sadly, this was long before the days of early warning systems, and with no evacuation plan in place, the total death toll was around 26,000. with another 145,000 dying of complications from the contaminated water. This fail was deeply tragic. Number 4. The Great Molasses Flood. We usually don't hear too much about molasses these days. Well, not outside of old-timey movies, but back in the early part of the 20th century, it was all the rage, otherwise known as black treacle. Molasses is a viscous substance derived from sugarcane or sugar beets, and it's primarily used to sweeten and flavor foods. Oh, and it also happens to be one of the stickiest liquids known to man, if you can even call it a liquid, that is, because it's so incredibly thick. Anyway, back in 1919, Boston's Purity Distilling Company stored molasses for transfer to a fermentation facility, which used it to produce ethanol. And it did this for quite some time without any issues. One fateful day, however, a tank holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst and flooded the entire north end of Boston. And this caused a little bit of a problem. The millions of gallons of molasses emptied from the tank at 35 miles an hour and reached a height of 25 feet. And the flow was not only strong enough to knock people over, but complete buildings too. At the end of all of this, people were stuck waist-high in molasses, and some of them even drowned, with an overall death count of 21, and a further 150 people badly injured. Ultimately, the company had to pay the equivalent of $9 million in damages, and we don't have any historical record of this, but I'm sure that for the rest of their lives, the owners of the Purity Distilling Company felt a little bit sick every time they heard the word molasses. Number 3. Surfside Condominiums. Otherwise known as Champlain Tower South, Surfside Condominiums in Miami, Florida is a relatively recent example of an unmitigated construction disaster. On June 24th of 2021, this 12-story, 136-unit building simply collapsed within seconds, killing 100 people and injuring a further 11. So was this simply a horrific, unavoidable accident, a freak occurrence? Well, no. Investigations revealed signs of serious neglect, and that the building had been badly in need of repair for over 2 decades. In fact, this had been reported as far back as 1996, but nothing had been done about it. Structural damage to the concrete, lack of serious weatherproofing, the list went on. And as the building was simply left to rot, things inevitably got worse. In 2018, a structural engineering firm claimed the Surfside Condominiums required a list of repairs costing upwards of $15 million. And needless to say, nothing was done that time either. There was a dangerous amount of corrosion, which was simply left to its own devices, and this led to the horrific incident when the building finally came tumbling down, not to mention leaving the blood of 100 innocent people on the hands of whoever was responsible. Truly tragic. Number 2. Deepwater Horizon. Surely nothing bad can ever happen when there's an oil company involved, right? Well, BP's Deepwater Horizon certainly deserves its place at number 2 on our list. Not only because it's one of the worst infrastructure fails of all time, but also because it's one of the worst man-made disasters in the entire history of humans. On the 20th of April 2010, this semi-submersible oil rig suddenly burst into flames, seriously injuring 17 workers and tragically killing 11. This was a terrible enough disaster on its own, of course, but the entire structure collapsed, sank into the water below, and caused the biggest oil spill in history. Deepwater Horizon had been digging deep for oil in an underwater exploratory well when high-pressure methane gas expanded into the marine riser, followed by the drilling rig, and then, well, boom. There was an explosion, the platform sank, and the oil was well and truly spilled. For the next 87 days, the equivalent of 5 million barrels of crude oil seeped into the Gulf of Mexico, which, in case you were wondering, is enough to cover the entire state of Oklahoma. By the time the spill was contained, it had already taken its toll on the wildlife, not to mention the loved ones of those who had perished. Number 1. The Leaning Tower of Pisa. Oh, come on, how could we not have this as number 1? If we're talking about infrastructure fails, we simply have to include this on our list, in the same way that everyone has to take that selfie of them holding the thing up with one hand if they're lucky enough to visit it. Originally built to house the bell of the Pisa Cathedral complex, the Leaning Tower would go on to enjoy a very different but no less prestigious future as one of Italy's major tourist attractions. So what happened with this wacky thing? Well, in a nutshell, it was built on unstable foundations, with the limestone base reaching only 3 meters deep into the dense clay bed, therefore being way too small, so it was always in serious danger of collapse. Strangely enough, however, the Leaning Tower was saved by something that isn't usually well known for saving people or buildings: war. After only 3 levels had been completed, war broke out between the Italian city-states, which meant that the foundations were able to settle, with construction continuing after the war. 5 years after completion, the Leaning Tower started to, well, lean. Fast forward to the 1990s and local authorities were adding 600 tons of counterweights to the base, which means that it's pretty much there forever now. And a good thing too, because everyone's got to have that photo in their collection, right? Watch our binge watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.